All right. We are now live. Hi and welcome to Red Reviews number 8 with Justin Clark. So I guess, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing good. Well,
awesome.
I've got a bit of a cold, but...
Right on. Yeah. It's been very humid and rainy here in Indiana, so we've had to deal with a lot of that. And
yeah. We have up north, there's like a forest fire. So the smoke is creating a haze everywhere, and like
oh yeah,
my allergies have been going wild, and yeah,
that's probably what you're alongside what you might be dealing with. That's rough.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, it's tough. Yeah, because it's almost like sometimes I like we're not having to really wear masks as much anymore. But there's a part of me that's like, well, maybe we should bring them back. I know I'm wearing my mask once winter hits.
Oh yeah,
because I didn't get a cold or I didn't get anything last year because I had my mask on all the time. So I'm definitely doing that once the fall hits.
Yeah, in Saskatchewan, on July 11th they removed all restrictions.
Yeah, that was here in Indiana. They did it far earlier, so they did it June. I think it was June 6th is when they did it. So. And I'm back full time in the office now. I don't remote work anymore. They pretty much just cut it off. They're like, you're not doing any remote work anymore. So it is what it is.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can maybe develop some kind of policy later on, but it is what it is. It's the joys of being a public employee that doesn't get to belong to a union. So
right. Geez, eh?
But anyway, yeah, I think that actually is a really good segue into the book we're talking about tonight. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism by Richard Wolff.
Cool.
I think it was published in 2012 by Haymarket Books. Great left independent book publishing company out of the States. And this book is the go-to guide about worker co-ops or worker cooperatives. What he calls in the book workers' self-directed enterprises, or WSDEs.
Right.
That's what he calls them in the book. Okay. And what it is this book is, I think, even more prescient than ever because I think it really gets into a lot of the deep structural problems within capitalism itself. One of the things I think that's really important for people to understand is what makes capitalism capitalism. So he does a really good job of explaining that. So like just as a theoretical marker, like, okay, well, what is capitalism? So a lot of people would say, well, it's markets. That's actually not, right? So there's market socialism, right? There's markets existed in pre-capitalist societies, whether that be in sort of feudal Europe or even earlier, bartering or exchange has been around almost as long as humans have. So markets themselves are not necessarily capitalistic. What makes capitalism capitalism is the private ownership of the means of production. That's what makes capitalism capitalism. And so he talks about, and he delineates it and explicitly calls it private capitalism because he compares it to state capitalism, which is the kind of economic model that existed in sort of actually existing socialist states like the former Soviet Union or today the People's Republic of China, Cuba, Vietnam to a greater or lesser extent, North Korea. So those have state capitalist models. They're not technically socialism yet, but they're close, or depending on how you look at it. But yeah, depending on how you look at it. But so private capitalism, the way that private capitalism is set up, imagine a business that someone owns. The employees are contracted out by the employer. The employer keeps the surplus value.
Right.
Which is, he keeps the profits, right? Well, why does he keep the profits? It's all in the way that the system is organized, right? So it's, if you have a situation where business is owned by one guy and he owns it, meaning he owns the capital, he owns the building, or he rents the building out, or he owns the capital stock, then he or she gets to benefit from the profits of what the workers produce. The workers don't have a say in any of that, generally. And this is one of the huge problems of capitalism. It lends itself to volatility. This is something we talked about earlier when we discussed Engels, where we talked about how there's the socialization and planning that goes on within firms, and then there's the chaos that exists outside of firms.
Right. The market.
And that the market, right? And production and distribution are often at odds with one another. But the one thing that Richard Wolff really harks on, and Richard Wolff, for those who don't know, he is a Marxist economist. I think he taught at the University of Massachusetts. And he actually set up his own organization called Democracy at Work. That is they're basically like a content creation company that does multiple different podcasts. So he does his Economic Update once a week as a podcast. They have a podcast called All Things Co-op, which is all just about different co-ops and people doing specific things relating to co-ops and sort of those kinds of stories. I think there's Capitalism Hits Home, which is all about like the relationship between capitalism and the family and sort of workers, gender issues, reproductive rights, that kind of stuff. So they do a bunch of different podcasts. So if you've listened to Richard Wolff for a lot for a lot of years, or you've listened to him a lot, you've kind of got the gist of what this book is. This book is a really great distillation, an overview of a lot of his broader concepts. So like it, it goes into, the crises of capitalism. So the book was published in 2012. So the big crisis of capitalism that he wrote about at the time was the crisis of 2007, 2008.
Right.
Obviously now we're living through the sort of the wreckage of another economic crisis due to COVID.
Yeah.
And he's actually written a new book called The Sickness is the System, which is kind of a sequel to this, where he talks about the problems of coronavirus in relationship to capitalism.
Cool.
And maybe we'll cover that at a future time or whatever. But yeah, so because capitalism is set up with private ownership, and specifically the thing that he likes to really point out that's super important is that production and distribution are really important, and we shouldn't discount those as understanding different economic models. But the other part of it that he thinks is super important is who gets to keep the surplus and why.
Right.
That's a really important part, right? So in private capitalism, the capitalism that we live under in the United States or Canada, even the most broad-based social democracies like Scandinavia, they are still private capitalist societies, is that a private firm gets to keep the surplus value of that firm. We discussed earlier, they get to keep the profits. Workers don't have any say in what those do and where those go, rather. Now, there are some arrangements that are not technically worker cooperatives where there are some inroads on this. So like in Germany, for example, there's, I think it's a particular piece of legislation or policy wherein certain amounts of a board of directors of a major corporation have to be employees.
Okay.
Which is something that when Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were running in 2020, they both advocated for, was workers on boards. Okay. Which is, I guess, better than nothing, but it doesn't really get to the heart of the problem, which is that if you have somebody who's a majority shareholder in a public company, say like, Amazon is a good example, right? So like, even if you had workers on the board of directors of Amazon, Jeff Bezos still owns the majority of the shares.
Yeah. How important are their votes, right?
Yeah. Their votes don't really matter all that much in relationship to everything else, right? Because they don't own like a managing stake.
Yeah.
So it would be better and it would help maybe alleviate some worker concerns, but overall it generally doesn't. And so one of the key tenets of Marxist theory is the idea of the decline of profit over time. So capitalist firms, as they get bigger and bigger and bigger, tend to just make less and less profits. And there's reasons for that. So it's like if you have to increase wages or you have to increase production costs, all of those things, right? So sometimes, it's like if you go into a fast food restaurant and you're like, wow, that meal I got seemed a little bit more expensive. The reason it's more expensive is because their ability to obtain a profit commensurate with what they want is not available under the current circumstances, right? They have to pay their employees maybe a little better, or the capital stock is a little bit more expensive. Like say, for example, right now in the United States, one weird side fact I learned, listening to a podcast recently was that there's a national chicken wing shortage.
Oh, is that right?
So like chicken wings are almost like really hard. They're really hard to get, so they're more expensive.
Okay.
You know, some foodstuffs are just going to be more expensive because it's a little bit harder to get them produced under the pandemic conditions.
Right.
Global
like
supply.
Fruit that's out of season or what have you.
Yeah, fruit that's out of season, meat, certain types of vegetables, like all of those are going to be, you know, that are seasonal. Like those tend to get more expensive. And the reason they get more expensive is because the capitalists who own those firms need to be able to turn a profit that works within the particular mode of production that we're in, which is private capitalism, right? So if profit is declining more and more over time, well, then how do you make up for that? Well, the way you do that is by squeezing workers, right? So like, you know, we know firms that have like absolutely devastated, you know, workers' ability to have any kind of real rights or any kind of redress of grievances within the system itself. So like Amazon's a great example of this, right? You know, the day that we're taping is the day that Jeff Bezos went into his giant dick-shaped ship in the sky.
Yeah.
It's hilarious that it was shaped like a giant dick, which it's like poetry, but you know, but you know, and he literally said today in the press conference, he said, "I want to thank Amazon employees and customers," and he didn't say like, "Because of your support, we've been able to achieve these things." Like put it in lofty rhetoric. Like he just fully dropped the fucking act and he literally said it, which is he said, "Thank you for paying for this."
Right.
I mean, he just flat out said it. So it's like, I couldn't have thought of a better real world example of what I'm talking about.
No kidding.
And so because of those problems, because of the problems inherent to capitalism itself, you know, the contradictions between production and distribution, the hoarding of the surplus by those who own it, the lack of real accountability or democracy within firms. I mean, essentially, if you work for a private company, you work for a private dictatorship. I mean, it's essentially a mini dictatorship in which you don't really have any rights. In the United States, there's something called at-will employment, which is that pretty much you can be fired for any reason and have no recourse against your employer. Generally, the only thing you can really have recourse for if you're not in a union. If you're in a union, it's a different situation. But if you're not in a union, you get fired. Really, the only way you could ever maybe account for that is if they fired you because you were an African American or you were a woman or you were a transgender person or you were gay. Like that's when you can make an argument under the Civil Rights Act like, hey, I was fired because I was gay, or hey, I was fired because I'm trans.
Right.
Like that, but that's it. Otherwise they can just kick you out the door. And they may already fire you for that, but then they use some other excuse on paper to get rid of you.
They just have to make up like some reason other than that.
Yeah, they can come up with some bullshit like insubordination, right?
Yeah.
So because of these problems, we've seen, you know, he spends a lot of the book, probably the first third of the book, talking about the crisis of 2007, 2008. So for those that don't really know about that, maybe you're a little younger or you need to pay attention at the time, I'll try to give you a quick overview of what that was. So back in the mid to late 2000s, there was a real estate bubble, a massive, massive real estate bubble here in the United States. And when this housing boom was going on, a lot of these loans were basically crappy loans that people were getting.
Yeah.
And they were called ninja loans, which is like no income, no job, no assets. That's what they called them, ninja loans. And they were also called subprime mortgages. This is something you probably have heard in the news or reading something, right? And what that means is that these are loans that are heavily leveraged, meaning like, especially if you don't have an income, you don't have a job, you don't have any assets, and you might buy $250,000 home, but you don't have any income coming in, right? Now, why was this a problem? Well, the reason this was a problem was, you know, over the sort of 10, 15 years after the deregulation of the banking and financial sector in the 90s and early 2000s by Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, what the financial firms were able to create these very intricate new financial instruments that could be traded on the market. One of them was called an MBS, or a mortgage-backed security. And what it was let's say you buy a house, your bank has your loan. In the old days, you would buy a home, and chances are you'd get the loan for your house from your local bank that you banked with. And your bank had your loan for the entirety of its loan. Okay? Yeah. That's how it used to be traditionally. But because of banking deregulation that happened in the 80s and the 90s and early 2000s, that's not how it was. So what happened was that banks, you would get a loan, then your bank would sell that loan to another institution. And then what that institution would do was break up the value of your mortgage into what were called mortgage-backed securities that people could then buy on the market. And this was really hot at the time. And so what happened was over time, everything got completely over leveraged and it got overexposed. Right. More people bought homes than they could afford, but that was also based on policy that was directed explicitly by the Bush administration that was like home ownership is like what we're trying to push for. And so there was a sort of a perfect storm of like people who didn't have the real income or assets to buy a home, mixed with deregulation that made it way easier for these toxic assets to exist. And then you had these other financial instruments that were based on these financial assets that were predicated on continuing your mortgage payments. Well, what happened was there was a sort of global economic slowdown that started around 2007. And when that happened, people lost some of their jobs and people were unable to pay for their mortgages. Right. And because they were unable to pay for their mortgages, they defaulted on they defaulted on their mortgage. And when they defaulted on their mortgage, all of these mortgage-backed securities and other financial assets got over leveraged and they were basically worthless. And all of these firms they basically owed a massive amount of debt that they could not pay, which led to massive, system-wide failures. So one of the major firms that failed during the 2007-2008 crisis was Bear Stearns. Bear Stearns fell. It was sold for pennies on the dollar, I think, to either Goldman Sachs or Lehman Brothers was the other one that collapsed in the 2007-2008 crisis. AIG was another one that collapsed during that period. So you had all of these breakdowns. Right. So what did the federal government do here in the United States to remedy this crisis? Well, what they could have done, what they should have done, was nationalize the banks, fire the top leadership, if not throw them in jail, because what they were doing was some of it was actually criminal. And then what they should have done was made homeowners whole. So they should have developed some kind of program to keep people in their homes. Right. And they didn't do that. Instead, what they did was, instead of really nationalizing the banks, what they did was they bailed them out. Yeah. And that was what was called the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. Which was this, $700, $800 billion package that was passed at the very end of the Bush administration and administered under the early days of the Obama administration. One of the things that the Obama administration did do early on was they did develop, I think either through the stimulus bill that was passed in 2009 or Dodd-Frank, which was the financial regulatory bill that passed in 2010, was they developed a sort of homeowner protection program. But the problem is it's a very perfect example of, shitty bourgeois neoliberal government where they develop what on paper looks pretty good. Like, we're going to develop this program to keep people in their houses. Like, that's great. Problem was they didn't really fund it, and it kind of collapsed under the weight of the need because they didn't really put the sort of the bureaucratic infrastructure in place to make that policy work, nor did they really fully fund it the way they should have. And so instead of bailing out the people and taking over the banks and holding them accountable, what happened was the complete opposite, where the banks were bailed out, the financial institutions were largely, and they were largely off the hook, and the American public were stuck holding the bag. Right. And why did this happen? It happened because there were private firms that were interested in profit, and there was a speculative bubble based on real estate. Mm-hmm. And, it's not unlike the Great Depression. The Great Depression of 1929, the Great Crash of 1929 and led into the Great Depression of the 1930s was very much the same way. It was people making a bunch of speculative buys on the stock market, but they didn't actually have the capital to back up the purchasing of stock or the trading of stock. And when you don't have the money to pay for the losses that you've incurred doing trading, it's called a margin call, where people would buy stock what was called on margin. So you'd pay 10% of the value of the asset as collateral, right, and then you would pay it off with whatever gains you got. Well, the thing is when the stock market went through the floor in 2008, and then also went through the floor in 1929, the people didn't have the money. So everything went belly up. And
right.
And in some respects, and in many respects, the 1929 crash was much worse because the Federal Reserve didn't really respond to it in the way that the Federal Reserve responded to the crisis of 2007, 2008. So
lessons learned, I guess.
Lessons learned, right? So so you have a massive economic crash in 2007, 2008. You have a massive recession that lasts for many, many years. And for some, the recession never really ended, which has led, I think, in the United States to continuing political crises and the election of Donald Trump. Yeah. I said for years that the neoliberal order that existed in 2009, 2010, Obama and the European Union and all that, and the rest of it, they were able to sort of stabilize the system, right, as best as they could. And so the economic crisis that could have been much worse, and in many ways it still was terrible, but could have been much worse, they largely dealt with. And I said for years, even before I was, a Marxist or a socialist, I said for years, there's going to be an impending political crisis. The reason we didn't get the political crisis right away was because people were in sort of panic mode. And so they sort of trusted the elites to figure it out. Well, post, 2014, 15, the political crisis, in my opinion, started to begin. And that was, and some could say it started earlier with the Tea Party and shit. But
right, you could draw lines through whatever happened. But.
Yeah. But yeah, I think a lot of it is the result of sort of bad government policy, which is rooted around which is based around the fact that the economic model in the United States is private capitalism. Yeah. When you have private ownership, there's a certain level of chaos and inefficiency and contradiction. Yeah. So the way to remedy that crisis is through worker cooperatives. It's through worker self-directed enterprises, or WSDEs. What WSDEs do, what they are, is essentially a firm that is of, by, and for the workers. So instead of, a sort of board of directors and a CEO that sit up at the top and make a lot of money at the expense of everybody else, and the workers do all the work and they sit up top and keep all the money, that goes away. That's not to say that there aren't managers, because there are. So there are, but it's a much more horizontal model. So it's not completely without hierarchies, but the hierarchies are fully democratic in the sense that the workers choose the governing body of the organization that they work for. Right.
And so if they don't think somebody's doing a good job, then they can vote somebody else in or choose somebody else.
Exactly. They approve a manager's salaries. They approve the pay and compensation for people. So I think this would help solve the sort of CEO pay problem. Right. Because there are a lot of people who are high up CEOs who make crazy amount of money who are complete fucking failures. Yeah. I think of somebody like Carly Fiorina, who was the CEO of Hewlett Packard in I think the late 2000s or early 2010s. She ran that fucking company in the goddamn ground. And then she got to leave that company with a massive multi-million-dollar payout. Right. I think her name's Meg Whitman is another person like this, where, these people fail upwards. And the reason why they get to do that is because the way that private capitalism is set up is that the workers don't really have much of a say over who gets to be in what positions, what they get paid, and what they actually do. So worker co-op is set up differently, where, they choose the leadership, they choose the workers, and the leadership themselves are from the workers. So generally, and that's how unions used to actually be. So my mother-in-law worked for Chrysler She worked for them for 4 decades. She was a member of the United Auto Workers, the UAW. And what she told me was when she started back in the late 1970s into the early 1980s, union stewards or leaders within the UAW, they used to be people who worked on the floor. They were people who were actual workers who then became leaders within the union. Today, unions don't really work like that. Most of the leadership within unions in the United States, most of them are people who've never actually worked like the actual job that they're in. Most of them are college educated. Most of them are completely divorced from most of the regular concerns of working people. The unions have really become sort of corporatized in the United States. I imagine Canada is probably similar.
It's very similar, yeah.
And, where essentially they're willing to sell out their workers for just a slightly better, possibly better arrangement.
Yeah.
But what worker cooperatives do is that you're not at the whim of the employer because you are your own employer along with your colleagues. So that is a completely different model, and it solves a lot of problems that exist within private capitalism. But according to Wolff, it also solves a lot of problems with what's called state capitalism, or what we might call actually existing socialism. So if you think of socialist states or broadly socialist states like the former Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, Vietnam, Cuba, North Korea, Nicaragua under the Sandinistas.
Right.
So Burkina Faso, and state capitalism itself is a term that actually comes from Lenin. V.I. Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, the first head of the Soviet government before his death in 1924, state capitalism was a term that he developed to sort of explain what they were doing. So, in Marxist theory, a socialist or even a communist society is built upon stages of development. And so with Russia, they were sort of a feudal peasant society. And so what Lenin said was it was sort of a step up to go into what was called a state capitalist model. And what's the difference between state capitalism and private capitalism? Private capitalism, the means of production are owned by private individuals.
Right.
In state capitalism, the means of production are owned by the state. Now, some of you might go, well, wait, isn't that socialism? In some respects, it is. I do think on some level, sometimes I do think public ownership is a form of socialism.
Right.
But again, what's Richard Wolff's main point is that what makes a really healthy, democratic, vibrant socialism is where does the surplus go and who has control of where that surplus goes.
Right.
So in private capitalism, that surplus is divided among the shareholders. It's divided up amongst the elite top of a company who then decides for them, and the workers don't. Yeah. In the Soviet Union or in other sort of state capitalist societies, the process is largely the same, but instead of it being sort of, a board of directors, it's like it's a ministry.
Right.
It's ministry officials, it's government bureaucrats who sort of develop that, and policymakers. So the state directs where the surplus goes. And one of the criticisms of sort of state capitalism or the sort of Soviet model or the PRC model is that surplus is not truly developed and distributed democratically because it's this sort of top-down model.
It's still okay. So in Saskatchewan, we have our crown corporations, which is a sort of state capitalism where the province owns Sask Energy, Sask Power, and basically all our utilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and so their profit, it goes into the government coffers. It doesn't automatically get distributed to, say, the citizens or the workers of the company.
Exactly. That's exactly right. The United States is the same way. So a good example of that would be the United States would be some of the energy companies, but they're sort of, again, the problem with this sometimes, and he acknowledges these terms are kind of squishy because sometimes a firm can kind of be sort of private capitalist, sort of state capitalist, utility companies are like this here in the States, so my electricity provider is AES, which it used to be called IPL, Indianapolis Public Light, and Indianapolis Power and Light, and it was bought up by a bigger company called AES. So they're like this sort of quasi-public, quasi-private institution that sort of exists, in Superman 2, it's like the Phantom Zone.
Right.
So it's like, those exist as well. And those did exist within actually existing socialist states like the Soviet Union. So the inefficiencies and the sort of deep contradictions that exist within private capitalism can also exist within state capitalism. This is something that we'll actually talk about more in depth when we cover Michael Parenti's book, Black Shirts and Reds. He devotes an entire chapter to the sort of economic conditions that led to the end of the Soviet Union and why. And he goes into a really good explanation of what were the sort of internal problems that existed within the Soviet system. Because there were some, for sure, deep ones. Right. And so WSDEs, or worker co-ops, resolve some of these issues again, because again, instead of the surplus being divided by government bureaucrats or by bureaucrats working within a private firm, it's divided by the workers. And so what Wolff essentially argues for in the book is a form of market socialism, where you would certainly have public ownership, you would certainly have public planning, but alongside public like state ownership and state planning, you would also have worker cooperatives working within a market-based socialist system, which I think for transition's sake is good. Like, I'm not against that. I think it kind of gives everybody the best of every system. So I think like markets can be a very beneficial thing when regulated and when sort of curbed by the excesses of the issues within that system, at least as a transitory thing to getting to something else. And then I also do think state ownership and state planning has a place. So one of the things that I personally advocate for, and it's something he talks a little bit about in the book, is public banking, where banking would be controlled by the state. And then, of course, you would have sort of democratic checks and balances to those systems. Right. And they would be far more open and accountable and democratic as state institutions than they would be as private institutions, and they would work better. And I mean, if you want a real example of exactly what I'm describing, the People's Republic of China is a lot like this, where they do have public banking, and they have public finance, so that it allows them to direct their resources more efficiently based on need. And so, criticisms of the PRC aside, and I'm happy to hear all those, but that's one thing I think they do right. And I think that's something we could do in the States. And in fact, we did do it in the United States. From the 19-teens up into the early to mid 1960s, the United States had public banking, and it was at the post office. It was postal banking, where you could go in, you could have a bank account, you could have a checking account, you could have a savings account, you could get your check cash there. I mean, imagine if the United States moved to a public banking model with the post office. The benefits of that, would be incredible. First off, the post office wouldn't have the insolvency problems that it has. We can get into a whole other discussion about why those exist, because it's a deliberate result of public policy of right-wingers who, because the U.S. Postal Service is the only federal government agency that requires its pension plan be funded through the next 75 years. No other pension plan is required to do that. Yeah. So even though the post office is handling more money than ever and more demand than ever, and they make an incredible amount of money for the public, they're in the red, even though if you took away this stupid bureaucratic thing that was passed by shithead Republicans during the Bush 43 era, they would be in the black, but because of the way that that's set up. But anyway, like if you went to a public banking, imagine like the sort of shitty check cashing places would be gone overnight.
Right, yeah.
So imagine if like we had public banking where people get checking accounts, savings accounts, they could get quick loans that would be set at government mandated interest rates that would not be exorbitant. Yeah. And like, I think that would be great. So like, there would be certain sectors of the economy that would definitely be state directed, but they would also be mixed with worker cooperatives and markets. And that's kind of the model that he advocates for, and it's one that I think is worthwhile to think about.
It's certainly worth the examination.
Yeah. And so, you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, well, this all sounds great in theory, but how does this work in practice? Well, there are actually real worker cooperatives that do exist and that are very successful. I'll give you a couple examples. I'll give you a small one and a big one. One's in the United States, one's in Europe. The small one that I'll give you is from the United States. It's a little place out in Maryland called Red Emma's. Red Emma's is this cooperative. It's named after Emma Goldman, the anarchist thinker. And it is a bookshop and vegan restaurant. And it is a worker cooperative. The workers own the business. They decide how that business is run democratically. They set wages. They set policy. They set who's going to be in leadership and who's not. And it's an extremely successful business. And, up until the pandemic, it was really an incredible example of it. And they survived the pandemic, thank goodness. But it's one of thousands. There are literally thousands of worker cooperatives within the United States.
Right. Yeah.
Some of them are probably gone now due to the pandemic, but there have been thousands for years. And so there's the sort of the micro example. The sort of macro example, the big one that everybody talks about is the Mondragon Corporation, which is out of Spain. Mondragon is a company that is a corporation that is essentially a federation of cooperatives that work together. I think it has like 80,000 employees, and it's the most successful worker cooperative in the world. It's not like a socialist paradise, but it's certainly a working model of how you could do, worker cooperatives in real time. Mondragon Corporation does a variety of different products and services. Because of the sort of federated model that it has. So I think some of it's insurance, some of it's actually like, consumer goods, some of it's maybe banking.
Okay.
But it's very successful, extremely successful, and it's based on that model. And I think that the highest CEO to work, or the sort of manager or CEO to worker ratio within the Mondragon Corporation is anywhere between 3 to 8 to 1, which is pretty good, and whereas in the United States, the average CEO to average worker, ratio is, I think, 300 to 1.
Right.
So again, it's not completely without hierarchy. It's not completely without any kind of like structure, but it's one that is extremely democratic. It's accountable, and it actually works. And I think that those are great examples. And so, this is the cure. He calls this, the subtitle of this book is A Cure for Capitalism. And I think that worker cooperatives are one part of the cure for capitalism. I don't think they're the thing. And I don't think they're the one thing. I think sometimes Wolff, oversells them as the one thing, but I don't think that, because I do believe in a socialist future, based on my own political orientation, that I do think that there is some state ownership and planning that has to happen. I don't see us handling the sort of larger crises, because one of the things that I think he sort of talks a little bit about in the book, but I would like to hear more on, is the relationship between worker co-ops and environmental issues. Because I don't think climate change is going to be solved merely by worker cooperatives. I just don't.
Yeah. No.
So, yeah.
It's like you have to separate. Well, I guess it depends on how the worker cooperatives would handle, like how these companies would handle climate change and environmental issues. But just on its face, the theory almost is separate, right? Yeah.
And he discusses it in the book. But again, I mean, my whole thing is that, like, there can be times where the interests of the workers' cooperative are going to be at odds with what is in the interest of the environment. So, like, even if you have a firm that is like perfectly democratic, they could all just collectively democratically decide together, we're just going to, put our waste into the river next to us.
Right.
And so the thing is that, like, worker co-ops, I think worker co-ops that exist in a vacuum with, if you were to sort of plop worker co-ops into the current model we have right now, it would be better, but it would not solve the problem. Right. I still think that there needs to be a major shift in how resources are allocated and distributed. Like, I don't see it without any kind of like large scale public planning. I don't see issues like climate change or inequality really being addressed solely by worker co-ops.
Right.
So yeah, I think, in my opinion, at least, I think that and I think he sort of hints at this too, but like a worker cooperative economic model would have to be paired with an extremely generous, social democratic welfare state that would have to buffet it, right? And he talks about that, like if let's say you lose your job at a co-op, then you would get you basically get the 80% of your wages through the government is sort of an interim into getting what you would have your next job.
Okay.
And then the other thing is that the United States should always, like in any society, should have an employer of last resort. So like, let's say, you have somebody who can't get a job at any co-op because there are some people who aren't going to be able to work in a co-op.
Yeah.
What do? Well, for them, I think having them, be, employees of the state would be another way of doing that. And so you would have, public works like you did during the New Deal in the 1930s. And which brings us to a really important point that I kind of glossed over when talking about the history of how we got to where we are, which is the New Deal in the United States. In the 1930s, this massive, reorganization of American life and American government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd president, in the 1930s. Well, why did that happen? It didn't happen merely because of his benevolence, although, I think the thing about Roosevelt that made him, I think, a very, a good president, for as good as you can use that term, right? Is that he was not as ideologically rigid. He was willing to listen to others and sort of have people around him who were different. And in the 1930s was when the left in the United States was at its peak, was not at its peak, but at one of its peaks. So you had a very successful, viable socialist movement. You had a very successful, viable communist movement. And these movements pushed Franklin Roosevelt to do these things because essentially Roosevelt will tell you, if he was here and I could talk to him, like his whole thing with the New Deal was saving capitalism from itself. And he saved capitalism. And so, because otherwise there was going to be a revolution.
Right.
And there was going to be pitchforks and torches, And so Roosevelt had the foresight to understand that. The other thing is that, but he did have a very strong, viable left movement on the outside pushing him to be better.
Right.
Back in 2008, 2009, when Obama was elected, a lot of people said, well, he's going to be like FDR. He's going to be like the next FDR. And there was a lot of hope for that, and I think I bought into that hype a little bit. I remember when Time magazine ran a front cover of Obama where they had his face photoshopped onto Franklin Roosevelt's body, and he had like the little hat and the monocle on, the little Prince Nez glasses and the big cigarette thing sticking out of his mouth. But that didn't happen. No. And that didn't happen for a variety of reasons, right? And one of them was because the United States did not have a viable left movement that could force him to do it.
Yeah.
What actually happened was not a revolutionary movement, but a counter-revolutionary movement that happened during the Obama years with the Tea Party.
Yeah.
And all of that sort of anger and populist energy, which could have been harnessed for good and could have led to something like a New Deal, actually led to, austerity, more neoliberalism, and Donald Trump. So
Which, I mean, you can draw a number of conclusions as to where that sort of those pressures came from and why that Tea Party movement was the way it was. Like, there's been an ongoing propaganda war for a long time about pushing people to the right and believing in like neoliberal austerity programs and shit like that.
Absolutely. And our book that we'll discuss next week, Nixonland, will go into a lot of the history of how that started and kind of the development of the modern American right and how we got to where we are. And the problems and the internal failures and problems within the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party has been essentially a clusterfuck for 50 years. And we'll talk about that next time. But yeah, so why is what I just said important? if you had a system of worker cooperatives, you would have more worker democracy.
Yeah.
You would have a more viable socialist, communist, anarchist, broader left-wing movement, because you would have people within worker cooperatives who would be more in tune democratically. They would have more local control. They would be far more democratically engaged, and they would largely be more engaged citizens as a result. Yeah. And as such, their interests will be aligned in actually like developing movements that could push the sort of federal leadership to be better and push them to the left. You know, there's no way to push somebody like Biden to the left right now, because the left movement doesn't exist as an organized mass, right? And, you know, the sort of left in the United States post Bernie is, you know, a bunch of different splinter groups but there's no broader sort of uniting popular front that existed like there was in the 1930s. You know, maybe some other time with another related book, we can go into why that popular front sort of existed and why it was successful. And then ultimately how it was undermined in the 1940s and 50s. But, you know, the United States hasn't really had a large viable left since the 1930s. Right. So this is our chance. I mean, this is our chance to sort of change that, right? And so, you know, regardless of your specific political orientation, you know, Corey and I are different. You're an anarchist. I'm a Marxist-Leninist. But like that sort of broader umbrella that could sort of force these sort of short-term gains while we're fighting for the larger battles. Yeah. So worker cooperatives are a part of that. You know, they're sort of a reform on the way to revolution. They're not a contradiction of a revolution. They're a part of it. Right. And so they're one way of us getting us there. And I think even if like at the very least, you know, let's say we don't get the revolution right, like at the very least, I'm always hoping for evolution. I'm a revolutionary optimist. Yeah. But you know, if we don't, then at the very least, we will probably get a far more social democratic system where, you know, a lot of the harsher edges of capitalism are shaved off, and that gives us the energy to fight for more. Yeah. And so, this is an extremely short book. It's less than 200 pages. It's very, very easy to read. Richard Wolff has an incredibly, very straightforward, easy to read style. He's very good at explaining big concepts. And he's fun to listen to. Like, he's just fun to listen to because he's like he's like this larger than life New Yorker. And so he has this large personality, and it carries through in the book and it carries through in what he does. So I've listened to a number of interviews with him and some of his own videos too. And I always enjoy them, even if I don't entirely, you know, grab onto what he's saying. I 100% enjoy listening to what he's saying. Yeah. And so, you know, I'm pretty bullish on co-ops. I think they're a good thing. I think they're a model that we should move towards, because if worker ownership of the means of production is what socialism is, then worker cooperatives are one part of that. Absolutely. And so I think that, you know, people should definitely check it out. It's through Haymarket Books. You can buy it through haymarketbooks.com if you don't want to give that bald fuck any more money. I highly recommend it. It's a great book. And not only will you learn about cooperatives, but you'll really get a great overview of like the economic and political history of the United States over the last 100 years. Right. He covers a lot of ground in a short amount of pages, but does it in a way that's not like hard to understand or overwhelming. I think he does a really great job of simplifying this to stuff and synthesizing this stuff to make it accessible for folks who aren't, you know, who don't have a PhD in economics. Right on. Okay. So we're recommending this book. Absolutely. Definitely check it out. It's, you know, as Cornel West has a little blurb on the front of it, and he calls it required reading. Noam Chomsky has a nice blurb on the back. A New York Times Magazine calls Richard Wolff America's most prominent Marxist economist. I think that's true. Understanding Marxist economics is great because it gets you out of the sort of traditional paradigm of either like Keynesianism, which is sort of the main thread of the progressive liberal left in the United States or broadly, and then neoclassical economics or supply side or Reaganomics or neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it on the right.
Right.
So Marxist economics sort of breaks through that paradigm and gives you a different kind of model. So yeah, I definitely highly recommend the book. Definitely check it out.
Cool. Where can people find your content?
Sure. So I'm online at justinclark.org. You can follow me at JustinClarkPH on Instagram and LinkedIn. I'm not on Twitter. It's not good for my mental health to be on Twitter, so I'm not. I'll be having a forthcoming article on the friendship between Eugene Victor Debs, the American Socialist Labor leader, and Robert Ingersoll, coming out in the Truth Seeker magazine sometime in the fall.
Very cool.
And then I work for the Indiana Historical Bureau. And so, definitely check out some of the work that we do at the Indiana History blog and Hoosier State Chronicles and all those related projects that I do for work. And then I'm also affiliated with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. If you're interested in learning more about sort of, Marxist theory or thinking about belonging to a political organization that has a Marxist orientation, the PSL is a great organization to get involved in, and you can learn more about them, I think, at pslweb.org. So, yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks again for another great review.
You're very, very welcome. And next time we'll be talking about Nixonland, the Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America by Rick Perlstein, which is the second volume in a 4-volume history of the rise of American conservatism in the 20th century. So we're going to be talking the late 1960s. We're going to be talking Nixon. We're going to be talking George McGovern. We're going to be talking radical revolutionaries fighting against the evils of the Vietnam War. And we're going to be talking Watergate. So we'll be talking all kinds of stuff history-wise next time.
Awesome.